Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
You bet your sweet ass you are. And if you're tired of picking between the lesser of two evils and news presented in either red or blue, welcome to your safe space, because every week we discuss the structural issues driving dysfunction in Washington, and more importantly, what we can do to fix it. Now, 5 months have passed since Americans elected Trump to his second term in office, and we all know what that means. It's time to start talking about the 2026 midterms. Kill me now. In recent weeks, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has been very publicly asserting itself, with AOC and Bernie Sanders making a series of high-profile appearances across the country, and others threatening primary challenges to those in the party's more centrist establishment wing. Some welcome this as a bold shift in a party that has too tepidly spoken to the problems facing many young and working-class voters, while others fear it could further alienate moderate voters. But which is it? Big surprise, we have an opinion, and we're going to talk about it today. But first, Shawn, I don't know if anyone listening can hear this, but you shaved your beard.
I know I did. Yeah. 1 week after you complimented it too. I know. Beards can be hard to maintain sometimes. So.
We were going to be beard brothers, and then it all just got blown to bits.
Right.
It's this. The summer is really like that's when the real beard diehards are made. Like if you keep your beard through the summer, you're in it, and I'm in it. So, well, it was nice to have you for that brief period. Let's move on to the story at hand. So, you and I. Over the past week have noticed a few stories popping up that talk about how the party's progressive wing has started to become more assertive and more aggressive within the Democratic Party. I think the biggest story we should talk about is one regarding AOC, and you're the one who brought this to my attention, so maybe you could talk about what happened there.
So Nate Silver on his podcast on a Substack has made the prediction, a bold prediction, that AOC will lead the 2028 Democratic primary. You mentioned how we're, talking about the 2026 midterms. Well, we're already talking about the next presidential election, which really highlights a very exhausting reality in our politics that we are never free from the presidential campaign cycle. And I think there are certain things that are certainly aligning toward this pick that they pointed out. A Yale University poll shows AOC's favorability at 62% among Democrats. That's 3 points higher than Kamala Harris, and the highest favorability rating of any Democratic official polled. Then you look at the Fighting Oligarchy tour that she and Bernie Sanders are on across the country, drawing tens of thousands of people to these rallies in a year that is not a major election cycle. It's not the midterm or presidential election year, and yet they got 36,000 people in Los Angeles, 34,000 people in Denver, 20,000 in Tucson, even 12,400 people in a town in Idaho. That is Trump country. So there is an appeal that she has, and she doesn't just have people who like her. Her supporters love her.
Yeah, and first off, to Nate Silver and Galen Druk, just stop. Stop. We're exhausted. We are absolutely exhausted. This is like putting out your Christmas decorations after Easter.
Yeah.
It is way too soon. Way too soon. It's not going to stop us from talking about it, but it is way too soon.
Right.
And this story is interesting because when you put it in the context of a few other stories that came out over the last couple of weeks, you start to see a pattern emerge. I think the biggest one I saw, aside from this AOC draft pick for however decisive that is 4 years out. So David Hogg, one of the survivors of the Parkland school shooting, Democratic activist, launched an organization called Leaders We Deserve, and it pledges $20 million to primary safe seat Democratic incumbents who are viewed as ineffective or too in line with the establishment. And he's explicitly stated, we're not going to jeopardize the Democratic majority by going after swing districts. We're really going to focus on safe seat Democrats. Party leadership is also under internal pressure. So Dick Durbin, who's now 80 years old, likely retiring. There are big questions about who his successor is going to be. Chuck Schumer, of course, has seen his approval ratings drop. So they went from 30% in January of 2025 to 23% in April. 53% of New Yorkers want him to step down. And there's this sense that this is a generational and ideological movement to really change the shape of the party.
It seems like the younger, more progressive wing of the party has found an opening for them to reshape and realign their party, especially now that they've gotten a foothold within Democratic leadership. David Hogg is a vice chair to the DNC. Hakeem Jeffries is a very young guy who is in a top leadership position in the House. And even when you look at someone like AOC, what's interesting about this is that this is not long after the story of Nancy Pelosi kind of campaigning to keep AOC out of a ranked position within the House, but that hasn't stopped her influence on this growing young progressive wing that's found a foothold and wants to leverage it now. They see the institutional focused Democrats, the centrist of the old wing of the party, are just the response just isn't adequate right now to meet the moment, and they want to leverage that and take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we talk about a lot on this podcast as well is how there has been this war between the institutionalist establishment wings of either party and, let's call them, maybe the more radical or bolder, to kind of water that down a little bit, either in the form of the progressive Democrats like AOC or the MAGA movement on the right. Now, of course, before we get into that, there's a question I always ask when we have these conversations, Shawn. Do you remember what it is?
No, I don't.
It's cool if you don't. It's cool if you don't. So that question is, has this happened before? The answer is always yes, Shawn. It is always yes. It has happened before. And what we see in American history, there are always major political realignments driven by populist movements that pop up during times of financial strain. There were 3 in the 1800s. So 3. Not 100% relevant to where we are today, but there are 2 that draw very interesting parallels. I think the first one and the most recent one is the Tea Party movement, which you could argue was really driven out of the same financial strain that we're still kind of living through today. I don't think the economy's ever rebalanced from the financial crisis in 2008. And of course, the Tea Party did what it appears the progressive movement is doing, which is they went into a lot of safe Republican districts. They primary GOP leaders who they viewed as too moderate or too establishment out. And at least in the very beginning, very decentralized, fueled by small dollar donations. Conservative media did a lot to amplify it, but it was very much an anti-elite, anti-federal government movement. Now, they all went on this process of eating their own for years until Trump came along. And Trump was really the one who managed to solidify the movement or absorb it into the MAGA movement overall.
The funny thing is that when you look at populist movements, whether it's from a more conservative side or more of a progressive side, they've all stemmed from this very anti-elite mindset. They see a government that is focused more on centralized power rather than speaking to the needs of individual people. And when you look at the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, this young progressive wing, they are seeing a lot of these voters that used to be shoo-ins for the Democrats to leave the party, the working class, right? Voters of color and other social economic groups that they need to win future elections. And right now, the current establishment wing of the party isn't reaching out to it and isn't really speaking to draw them back to the party.
Yeah, and I think there needs to be some sort of unifying message in there. So with the MAGA movement, the unifying message was the federal government's gotten too powerful. We need to tear it down effectively. Now, the second parallel is FDR's New Deal coalition, Ideologically, this is much more similar to where the progressives are. The only difference is FDR, of course, was a party insider. And the Great Depression was the financial catalyst for this. Now, like Trump, FDR took a somewhat fractious coalition and united them under this economic platform. Now, the interesting thing about FDR and Trump is that both of them were extremely skillful at using new media. Now, FDR was extremely skilled at using the radio. Trump has been extremely skilled at using social media. I think you could probably argue Obama was the same way. But either way, what unified these movements was a very strong, charismatic leader who used new media in a very effective way to mobilize voters. And so when we jump ahead to what's going on with the progressive movement, and especially with AOC increasing her visibility as the leader of that movement, I certainly think she matches that. She's a very strong, very, very charismatic personality, very astute at the use of social media. I think those two things could make her that unifying force. I think the question is there going to be that catalyst?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, when you look at AOC and Trump, a very important similarity they have is this brand recognition. AOC is three letters that a lot of people know today. Whether you pay attention to politics or don't, there's a lot of people who know who she is. And I think that's important when you are looking for this very centralized message going forward to 2028. Silver and Druk had mentioned that her supporters are fervent, right? Much like Trump's supporters. Trump may not have a majority of voters who are diehard supporters of his, but the supporters he does have, they're waving the Trump flags. They're wearing the MAGA hats, right? They are ride or die for him. AOC has that base of support that are going to stick with her through thick or thin, from the start to a primary to the end of it. And I think when you look for that centralized message, I think with this Fighting the Oligarchy tour, you're hearing it. When you look at the Tea Party, their message was that power was being consolidated by political elites and the establishment, and that needed to change. With the Fighting the Oligarchy tour, Sanders and AOC's message is power is being consolidated with the ultra wealthy. They're the ones who are making all the decisions, and it's only benefiting them, and they aren't actually putting out solutions for everyday Americans. And if we are in a position where, say, we're in a recession 3 years down the line, that could really help them.
I think that's far more effective, too, because what made FDR popular was the fact that the expansion of government benefited people economically, right? It still remains to be seen whether shrinking government budgets and shrinking government services is going to be a popular move. I would venture to say no.
Yeah.
However fiscally conservative people like to be, or like to claim they are, they love free stuff. You tell me how big of a fan you are of small government when you hit a pothole.
Right.
So I do think that the idea of giving people something will always work. Now, we could get into a philosophical argument as to whether that is the right thing to do. It doesn't matter. It's just voters like free stuff. Part two here, and something interesting that you kind of alluded to in your statement there, people really like AOC. So yesterday on TikTok and YouTube, I posted a short video commenting on Silver's prediction. And the comments I got were either people who really loved AOC or people who said she'd scare away moderates. And I think there's a misconception about how people vote and how elections work. Because I think generally conventional wisdom says you've got this large group of moderate voters who decide elections. And if you get somebody too radical, they're not going to vote for them. And I think that's been disproven in 2016 and 2024, because you could say pretty much whatever you want, and those moderates are going to vote for you, because the moderates writ large are functional partisans on election day. So these are the hold your nose voters. These are the people who they might not like the candidate they're voting for, but they really don't like the one on the other side. And so moderates in general are either functional Democrats or functional Republicans. And there's really nothing you can do or say to turn them away from the party they're going to vote for. So they're not where the goodies are in elections. And as you and I have talked about a million times before, the voters who matter in elections are the populists.
Mm-hmm.
They are the socially conservative, economically liberal voters. And so if AOC and Bernie and their coalition can approach those voters with a very strong economic message and not lean as much, if at all, into the cultural side of things, they're going to pull some of them over.
Right.
They're going to be able to pull some of them over. And the moderate Democrats who may not be as far to the left as AOC, they're going to vote Democrat anyway. They're not going to jump to MAGA.
Right.
Because, how Bernie feels about Medicare.
I really don't think the Democratic Party has learned from Trump's wins still.
No.
So Republicans, even Republicans who, behind closed doors will admit they don't like Trump, still voted for Trump because they're not going to vote for a Democrat. So again, you're speaking to the undecided voters, these independent voters that end up swaying elections, every single presidential election. Those are the voters that matter. And to speak to something I said earlier about the importance of brand recognition, both Trump and AOC were able to build their brands off a very important variable, which is perceived authenticity. And I think that's something that people are overlooking. How many people in 2016 said they voted for Trump because he said it how it is, right? Or, he spoke with candor and he wasn't afraid to shy away from speaking his mind, right? It's the same thing with AOC. People like AOC because she doesn't shy away from speaking her mind, even going against the Democratic establishment, which most recently with the shutdown fight.
Yeah.
And her critique of Chuck Schumer and how he didn't want to leverage a government shutdown to protect entitlement programs, which we now see is popular across the board. Even Republicans who like the idea of small government, to your point, love entitlement programs.
Mm-hmm.
And they are outraged by the prospect that they could be cut.
Yeah. I want to emphasize your point about authenticity, because that is really what drives a candidate, is the perception of authenticity, the perception that you have a connection with them and they're telling it like it is. And I think one of the challenges the Democrats have had, being guided by their more moderate, their more establishment wing, is that they prefer polish and credibility, quote unquote, over authenticity. And there's no such thing as credibility anymore, not because people aren't credible, but because people are just so disillusioned after one financial crisis, a series of wars of choice, declining quality of life. All those things have made people very skeptical that there's any such thing as institutional credibility. And to jump ahead a little bit, I think the next question we should ask is this good? I personally think the answer is no. And I'll explain why. If we look at what has happened to the Republican Party, they have been taken over by their right flank. So the Republican Party, in large because of Trump, is further to the right than it was in 2016. The moderates have largely been either snuffed out or sidelined. If the progressive wing takes over the Democratic Party, the ideological distance between those two parties is going to be even greater. And the impact of that on government is going to be even greater. There's going to be less of an incentive to compromise. There's going to be more of an appetite for the sort of bare knuckles politicking that we've seen. And I think probably bigger than that, and in a bit of irony, if an AOC or an AOC-like candidate were to take the White House in 2028, thanks to Trump's expansion of presidential powers, they'd be able to rebuild the federal government however they choose. And their power to fundamentally transform the role of the federal government would be enormous. So, I think if we go back to FDR's New Deal coalition, he was able to expand the size and the scope of the federal government, but he had to do it slowly. That apparatus didn't exist, and the presidency wasn't as strong back then. So Trump in his first 100 days has pretty much removed the guardrails for any future president. And so I think this could be an interesting case of be careful what you wish for.
I don't know if this is necessarily a good or bad thing, on the surface. And I don't know if things will get worse, because right now you do have a Republican Party who has moved so far to the extreme that even as the Democratic Party tries to hold on to their institutional centrism, it's not leading to any kind of compromise between the two sides. The gap between the parties is widening and continues to widen, even as the old guard of the Democratic Party fights the more progressive wing to move further and further to the left. So I'm not necessarily sure if it would lead to a worse outcome for more progressive wing to take over the Democratic Party, because I feel like we're at a point of no return until we see some systemic changes within our system that kind of incentivizes cooperation, which right now the current system doesn't.
Yeah, I'd agree there. I think that the other thing I'm concerned with is that I think democracy and democratic institutions last as long as the powerful feel they're useful. And we talked about this in the last episode, where the one guardrail against Trump installing himself as president for life is the fact that there are a lot of Republicans who want to be president. And they're not going to stand for anybody who keeps that from happening. I think one of my fears is that if Republicans see a more left-leaning Democratic Party rising and a left-leaning Democratic Party threatening to take over the White House, with the understanding that limitations on presidential power have pretty much been eroded entirely, there could be a substantial fear that they're going to be shut out of policymaking, and a real fear with an incoming Democratic administration, or subject to the sort of retribution that Trump's been hinting at making and arguably maybe has been making towards his political opponents. So my fear as well isn't just that we have this increase in polarization, but also that potentially maybe more Republicans start to think, well, you know what, maybe a permanent Trump is better than living under a President Ocasio-Cortez. I'm doing a little dooming here, but
yeah.
But I don't think that's entirely unrealistic.
I don't think you're entirely wrong. I think we are in an era where this partisan tit for tat between the Republican and Democratic parties is influencing how we approach election administration in certain states. And this could lead to more of these parties scheming to try to subvert or even get in the way of election results. And I think a good example of that is in North Carolina right now in that Supreme Court race that still hasn't been decided from back in November. It's all over, this accusation that there weren't proper procedures in identifying voters and that voters didn't fill out their information correctly and all of this, and raising all these issues to raise doubt in the election process and further fuel mistrust in the system. So I do agree. I think there are certain factions within the Republican Party who might stoop to that. But honestly, at this point, I don't know if that's going to change, and I don't know what you do about it.
Yeah, and the other thing, I'll counter my dooming with a little bit of historical perspective and optimism, maybe, which is, even if you take the left's opinion that elections are being undermined as fact, elections are still more transparent than they were in years prior. So we've had a less free country before. Obviously, we don't want to go back there, but it's just to say America survived, and it will survive.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of, how hard of a landing are we going to have here? One of the things I maybe want to cap this off with is that what we're talking about, and you mentioned this earlier, but what we're really talking about is a scenario created by a system that forces ideological distinct factions to bond under a more general party apparatus in order to be heard, right? So the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the centrist wing of the Democratic Party arguably are two different parties. The moderate wing of the Republican Party and the MAGA wing, definitely two different parties. And we have a system that forces them together because we have a system that more or less precludes all but two parties from existing. And so until we make it easier for these factions to gain power of their own accord and gain a voice without the need to partner up with sometimes conflicting factions, we're going to have this battle. We're going to have a less effective government, and we're going to have this increasing polarization over time.
To your point, I think as a result of the two-party system, we have this. We are conditioned to view things as you're either a Republican, you're a Democrat, or you're a centrist that's in the middle, and that doesn't really represent the electorate at large, which we've spoken to on this podcast many times now. That when you actually break down political ideology, there's far more nuance in the election, and I think that's why you're seeing. When Democrats emphasize the need for centrist candidates, what they're doing is playing it safe, and that's not really what voters want. They want someone who is going to speak to the issues at hand and speak very straightforward about it and be authentic in their messaging about it. Under the current system, we're never going to get past this very generalized view of the electorate as being you have to be Republican, you have to be Democrat, or you're just this ambiguous center, and and as a result, that ambiguous center never gets spoken to.
All right, Shawn. Well, we are going to cap it off there, my beardless friend. Thank you very much for listening. As always, Shawn and I have a simple request. If you like this episode and you like what you heard today, please write a review and rate it. This will help make us more visible on podcast platforms. And be sure to share this with anyone you think might want to hear this too. We started this podcast because we know there are more people out there like us who want more choices and better choices on the ballot. And if we can get the word out to people in large enough numbers, we can change things for the better. So thanks in advance for your support. The music you're hearing right now is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.